The alignment of the brass paperweight on my desk was off by exactly 1/4 of an inch. It shouldn't have bothered me. The rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Portland loft was chaotic. The distant sirens down on Burnside Street were unpredictable. But inside my office, geometry was the one thing I could control. I nudged the heavy brass cylinder to the left until it perfectly shadowed the edge of the mahogany blotter. Order restored. The financial ledgers glowing on my dual monitors were next. Column A reconciled with column B down to the final cent. It was 9:40 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the world was exactly as it should be. Then 3 rapid, frantic knocks shattered the quiet. I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. My neighbor, Arthur, was currently in Florida. His daughter, however, was supposed to be checking on his plants. I stood, the joints in my knees stiff from 4 hours of forensic data mining, and walked to the door. The security feed on the monitor beside the frame showed Madeline Gardner. She was dripping wet, her trench coat plastered to her shoulders, clutching a thick manila folder against her chest like it was body armor. Her mascara wasn't running, but the rigid set of her jaw told me she was holding back a storm much worse than the one outside. I disengaged the deadbolt and opened the door. "You're an accountant, right?" Madeline didn't say hello. She stepped into my foyer without waiting for an invitation, bringing the smell of damp wool and ozone into my sterile entryway. "I am a forensic financial investigator," I corrected, keeping my voice level. "I find hidden assets and dismantle fraudulent corporate structures." "Good." She dropped the soaked folder onto my pristine glass entryway table. I winced internally at the water pooling on the glass, but kept my hands at my sides. "Because my father is trying to steal my business using a trust clause, and I need a husband by Friday to stop him." I looked at the folder, then back to her. Madeline was 32, 4 years older than me, and usually carried herself with the kind of breezy, artistic confidence that made my structured mind itch. Tonight, the breeze was gone. Only the tension remained. I reached into the hall closet, retrieved a dry towel, and handed it to her. "Start from the beginning," I said, ignoring the marital request for a moment. "And please, wipe the folder before the ink runs." She took the towel, her fingers brushing mine. Her skin was freezing. I felt a sudden, heavy drop in my stomach, an instinct to shield her from whatever cold had seeped into her bones. I took a deliberate step back, maintaining my perimeter. "It's a generational trust," she explained, her voice shaking slightly as she dabbed the manila envelope. "My grandfather left me the seed money for my gallery, but my father is the executor. There's a morality clause, an establishment clause. He just invoked it today. If I am not legally married and demonstrating financial stability by the end of the week, he can legally freeze the gallery's operating accounts and absorb the assets back into the family holding company." "Show me the paperwork." I walked her into the kitchen, pointing to a stool at the granite island. I turned away to start the electric kettle. I needed to focus on a process. Water, heat, tea. It was a functional necessity to warm her up. When I turned back, she had spread out a 50-page legal document, the edges crinkled from the rain. I leaned over the counter, scanning the dense legalese. The typography was atrocious, a mess of Times New Roman with inconsistent line spacing. I pushed the aesthetic offence aside and zeroed in on Section 4, Paragraph B. He's leveraging a K1 disbursement schedule, I murmured, tracing the line with my index finger. He's claiming the gallery is a hobby, not a solvent entity. The marriage clause is just a smokescreen to prove you are anchored to a provider. I looked up, meeting her gaze. It's archaic, but technically binding under the current state trust laws. He wants me to fail, Madeline said, her voice dropping to a whisper. He's always hated that I didn't go into the family logistics firm. If I lose the gallery, Daniel, I lose everything I've built. She twisted a silver ring on her right hand, a nervous habit I had noticed the 3 times we'd crossed paths in the hallway over the last year. The friction of the metal against her skin was the only sound in the room, besides the boiling kettle. You need a proxy, I said, my analytical mind taking over. A verifiable entity to act as a spouse on paper, complete with commingled assets and a shared residence to satisfy the residency requirement of the clause. I need a fake husband, she corrected, giving a tired, cynical laugh. And I don't know anyone who has the financial credibility to stand up to my father's lawyers. Except you. I see your mail, Daniel. You get letters from federal regulatory commissions. And you thought walking in here, soaking wet and proposing marriage was the optimal strategy? It was the only strategy, she said softly. She looked around my immaculate loft. I can pay you. Once the trust unlocks my operational capital, I can write you a check. I didn't need her money. I needed her to stop shaking. I poured the hot water into a ceramic mug, dropped in an Earl Grey sachet, and slid it precisely to the center of the placement mat in front of her. I will do it, I said, the words surprising even me with their finality. But we do it my way. We establish a firewall around your gallery's assets. We file a counter-injunction to halt his seizure, and we make the marriage airtight on paper. Madeline stared at the tea, then at me. Just like that? You'll marry me? It is a contract to solve a logistical problem, I said, keeping my tone entirely professional. But there are rules. If we are to satisfy an auditor or your father's legal counsel, my address must be your primary residence starting tonight. The trust dictates cohabitation. Madeline blinked, her hands wrapping around the warm mug. I brought a suitcase. It's in the hall. She took a slow breath. But, Daniel, your guest room is an office. We only need 1 bed for the optics, but I don't want to intrude. The optics only matter on paper and at the front door, I replied quickly, cutting off the implication before it could take root in the air. You will take the primary bedroom. I will sleep on the modular sofa in the office. It is ergonomically designed. I will not compromise your comfort for a legal maneuver. Daniel, no, I can take the couch. Non-negotiable, I stated, pulling a fresh legal pad from my drawer. I clicked my pen, the mechanical sound sharp and decisive. Now, give me your father's attorney's name, the trust's EIN, and your current operating balance. She gave me a long look, the tension in her shoulders finally dropping an inch. The chaos of the storm outside seemed to mute against the thick glass of the windows. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me until the ledger is balanced, I said, writing down the first data point. We had work to do. The next 48 hours were an exercise in controlled collision. Madeline moved into my space, bringing an influx of colour and scent that disrupted my monochromatic routine. She left a bright yellow scarf draped over my charcoal armchair. She stacked her art catalogues unevenly on the coffee table. Every time I walked past them, my hands twitched, but I forced myself to leave them alone. This was her space now, too. On Thursday morning, I sat at my desk running a deep dive trace on Richard Gardner's holding company. I was using a specialized API to cross-reference public shell corporations linked to his name. The data was flowing in, line by line, a beautiful cascade of absolute truth. Madeline was sitting on the rug near the window, a cup of coffee resting dangerously close to her laptop. She was trying to manage a crisis with a vendor who was suddenly demanding upfront payment for an upcoming exhibition. "They're spooked," she said to the room, rubbing her temple. "Someone told the caterers that my accounts are unstable. My father is leaking rumours." I stopped typing. I looked at the screen, then at her. The exhaustion under her eyes was a physical weight I wanted to lift. "Give me the phone," I said. She paused, looking up. "What?" "Give me the phone. What is the vendor's name?" "Sarah from Elite Catering. But Daniel, you don't have to—" "Hand me the device, Madeline." She passed the phone. I took it, making sure our fingers didn't linger. I looked at the contact, dialed, and put it on speaker, resting the phone exactly in the center of my desk. "Elite Catering," a voice answered. "This is Daniel Gray," I said, my voice dropping into the flat, authoritative register I used for hostile depositions. "I am calling regarding Madeline Gardner's account. I am her husband, and I manage our joint financial portfolio." Madeline's head snapped up. "Oh," the caterer hesitated. "Well, Mr. Gray, we just have some concerns about the net 30 terms." "I understand," I said calmly. "However, you have a signed contract stipulating net 30. If you breach that contract based on unsubstantiated rumours, I will not only litigate for breach of performance, but I will audit the payment history of your last 3 municipal events. I noticed some discrepancies in your public tax filings last quarter while reviewing local vendors." Silence on the line. I hadn't looked at her taxes, but people with loose accounting always assumed the worst when a professional called them out. "There's no need for that," the caterer stammered. "We can honour the original terms." "Excellent. We expect the delivery on time. Good day." I ended the call. I pushed the phone back across the desk toward Madeline. She was staring at me, her lips slightly parted. "You didn't yell," she said quietly. "My father yells when he wants compliance. You just dismantled her." "Volume is a substitute for leverage," I said, turning back to my monitors. "I prefer facts. The catering is secured." I heard a soft exhale from her direction. It wasn't a sigh of frustration. It was the sound of a heavy burden being placed on the floor. "You're terrifying when you want to be, Daniel." "I am precise," I corrected. "There is a difference." I felt her gaze on me for a long moment before she went back to typing. The quiet room felt different now. The silence wasn't empty. It was a shield blocking out the noise of her father's intimidation. By Thursday afternoon, the illusion of safety cracked. I was in the kitchen, carefully measuring out coffee grounds, exactly 18 grams per cup, when Madeline's phone buzzed violently on the counter. She picked it up, reading a text message. All the colour drained from her face. "He did it early," she breathed. I stopped the grinder. "Did what?" "The bank. My gallery manager Sarah just called. The debit cards are declining. He froze the operating accounts. Her voice spiked with panic. The deadline wasn't until tomorrow. He moved the timeline. A financial freeze. The most blunt, brutal weapon in the corporate arsenal. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked over to her. She was trembling, staring at the screen as if it were a physical threat. He can't do that without a court order, I stated, my mind rapidly sorting the legal parameters. He's a board member at the regional branch, she whispered, her voice cracking. He bypassed the court. He just choked my business to death in one afternoon. She dropped the phone on the counter and covered her face with her hands. The tremor in her shoulders was violent. I didn't think. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her. I didn't do it to pull her close. I did it to stop her from shattering. I placed one hand flat between her shoulder blades, applying a steady, grounding pressure. The principle of the quiet room. I focused entirely on the sudden stillness that I needed to project. I breathed in slowly, forcing my heart rate down so hers would follow. Listen to me, I said, my voice a low, steady rumble against the top of her head.
A freeze is an administrative action, not a legal seizure. The money is still there. He is trying to induce panic, so you surrender the gallery.
Madeline leaned into the hold, her hands gripping the fabric of my shirt. The chaotic energy draining out of her was palpable. The physical contact was a grounding wire. We're going to the bank tomorrow, I said calmly, stepping back just enough to look her in the eye. I kept my hands on her shoulders, transferring stability. We have the marriage certificate from the courthouse yesterday. We have the commingled utility bills. And I have 30 pages of forensic evidence proving he violated fiduciary duty by acting before the stated deadline. She looked up at me, her eyes red but focusing. You found evidence? I am a detail-oriented man, Madeline, I said, dropping my hands back to my sides, re-establishing the boundary. He used a shell company to issue the freeze directive. It's a conflict of interest, and it voids the trust's morality clause entirely. She took a deep, shaky breath, her posture straightening. Okay, we fight. Friday morning at 10 a.m., the regional bank's boardroom was a masterpiece of intimidation architecture. Cold glass, heavy mahogany, and grey lighting. Richard Gardner sat at the head of the table, flanked by a nervous-looking branch manager and a sharp-suited trust lawyer, Mr. Hayes. Madeline and I walked in exactly on time. I carried a single black leather briefcase. Maddie, Richard said, his voice laced with patronizing sympathy. You didn't have to make this a public spectacle. If you just sign the gallery over to the family group, I can authorize a generous salary for you. Madeline didn't sit. She stood at the opposite end of the table, her posture rigid, projecting a calm she had rehearsed in my kitchen for an hour. I'm not signing anything, Dad, she said, her voice clear and carrying through the large room. And I'm not here to ask for my money back. I am here to instruct the bank to remove you as the executor of my grandfather's trust. Richard laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. On what grounds? You failed the stability clause. And don't tell me this boy next to you is a real husband. I ran a background check on Daniel Gray, an accountant who lives alone and measures his lawn. I didn't react to the insult. I opened the briefcase, withdrew a stack of bound, tabbed documents, and slid them across the long table. They came to a stop exactly an inch from Mr. Hayes's hands. I am a forensic financial investigator, I said, addressing the lawyer, not the father. I have audited the trust's activity over the last 48 hours. Paragraph 4, Section B, states the executor must act in neutral faith. 3 days ago, Mr. Gardner used a subsidiary holding company, Apex Logistics, to artificially suppress the gallery's credit rating, triggering the very instability clause he is now using to seize the asset. Mr. Hayes frowned, opening the binder. His eyes scanned the highlighted ledgers. The colour began to drain from his face. Furthermore, I continued, my voice a flat, measured instrument of fact. He initiated a freeze on her accounts yesterday, 24 hours before the legal deadline. That is a tortious interference with a business contract. If this freeze is not lifted in exactly 3 minutes, I will file these findings with the SEC and the State Banking Commission. The fines alone will exceed the value of the trust. The room went dead silent. Richard looked at his lawyer. He's bluffing. It's internal family business. It's wire fraud, I corrected gently. Madeline stepped forward, placing her hands flat on the table. She didn't look at me. She looked directly at her father. She was negotiating her own deal now. I had simply built the platform for her to stand on. "Lift the freeze, Dad," Madeline said, her voice turning into steel. "You resign as executor today and assign control to an independent third party. If you do that, Daniel doesn't file the report. You get to keep your reputation, and I get to keep my life." Richard's face mottled with anger, but he saw the reality in his lawyer's grim expression. The leverage was gone. The trap was broken. "Fine," Richard spat out, standing up. "Keep your little hobby shop. But don't come crying to me when this fake marriage falls apart." He stormed out of the room. "Mr." Hayes quickly signed the release forms, his hands shaking slightly. He handed the copies to Madeline. "The accounts are unlocked, Mrs. Gray. My apologies for the administrative error." We walked out of the bank and into the crisp Portland morning. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflective. Madeline stopped on the sidewalk, looking at the banking release form in her hand. She let out a laugh that sounded like a sob, then turned to me. "It's over," she said. "The gallery is safe. The trust is clear." "The immediate threat is neutralized, yes," I said, adjusting the handle of my briefcase. "You are financially independent." She looked at me, her expression softening. "I owe you everything, Daniel. I don't even know how to repay you for what you just did." "You do not owe me," I said quickly. Too quickly. The thought of this being a transaction suddenly felt incredibly hollow. The contract is fulfilled. We walked back to the loft in a comfortable, shared silence. When we got inside, the apartment felt different. The tension that had defined the space for the last few days was gone, replaced by a quiet realization that the necessity of our proximity had ended. Madeline went to the guest bedroom, her bedroom, and started gathering her clothes. I watched from the hallway, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. I wanted to tell her to stop. I wanted to tell her that the yellow scarf on the armchair didn't bother me anymore. But I couldn't find the practical logic to justify it. She walked out with her small suitcase, stopping in front of the kitchen island. "I guess I should head back down to my apartment," she said quietly, looking at the floor. I looked at the counter. Next to the coffee machine was a small magnetic calendar where I tracked my billable hours. Yesterday, I had written M, gallery meeting, on the square for Friday. I walked over to the calendar. I picked up the dry erase marker. My hand was steady, but my chest felt incredibly tight. I moved to the box for next Tuesday, and I wrote M, dinner, 7 p.m. I treated the action like a binding commitment. I put the marker down and turned to face her. "You are my legal wife," I said, my voice low. "The paperwork is filed. If you move back downstairs, it creates an unnecessary logistical inconsistency." Madeline looked at the calendar, reading the entry for Tuesday. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, lighting up her tired eyes. She saw right through the analytical excuse. "Logistical inconsistency," she repeated softly. "Yes," I lied, maintaining eye contact. "It is highly inefficient." She let go of the suitcase handle. She walked toward me, closing the distance that I had strictly maintained for 4 days. She stopped, inches away, looking up. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you want me to stay?" I looked at her resilience. I looked at the woman who had stood up to a tyrant in a boardroom and won. I took my hands out of my pockets. I reached out and took her hand. It wasn't a spark of electricity, it was the transfer of stability. The tremor in my chest stopped. The world stopped spinning. "Yes," I said. It was the hardest, most honest answer I had ever given. She stepped closer, eliminating the final boundary. When she kissed me, there was no frantic exploration, no desperate hunger. It was the principle of the arrival. It felt like walking through the front door after a long, exhausting journey and finally turning the deadbolt. A promise sealed without words. Heavy, grounding, and absolute. We broke apart slowly. I looked at the chaos of her suitcase in my pristine hallway. For the first time in my life, I didn't want to fix it. Closing thoughts. I learned that true strength isn't about controlling everything around you. It's about trusting someone enough to let them share the weight. Real love isn't about dramatic rescue. It's about consistency, safety, and choosing to show up when the paperwork is hard.